The wagon never even slowed. November 14th, 1873. The Bozeman Trail ran like a pale scar across the high plains of what would one day be called Montana. And on that morning, the wind came down off the Absaroka Range with the kind of bite that warned a man to keep his hands inside his coat or lose the use of them by sundown. The sky was the color of old pewter. The grass along the trail had gone brittle and brown. And somewhere in the middle of that vast and indifferent country, a 16-year-old girl named Clara Marsh sat in the dust where her father had thrown her, watching the canvas top of her family's wagon shrink to a small white blot against the mountains. She did not cry. She did not call out. She had known the way an animal knows what was coming the moment her father had climbed down from the bench an hour earlier and walked back to the rear of the wagon with that particular silence in his shoulders. Elias Marsh was a man who did not raise his voice when he was about to do something cruel. He raised it for small things. The big things he did quietly, the way another man might shoe a horse. He had pulled back the canvas flap. He had looked at her with eyes the color of river ice. And then he had taken her by the collar of her coat, the wool one her mother had patched at the elbows 3 years before her mother died, and he had pitched her out into the road like a sack of spoiled grain. A worn gray blanket had landed beside her a moment later, thrown by one of her younger sisters, perhaps. Or perhaps by no one at all. Maybe the wind had pulled it loose. She would never know. What she knew was this: the wagon kept moving. Her 2 younger sisters did not look back. The thin shoulders of her father did not turn. And the only sound was the creak of the iron-rimmed wheels and the slow drumming of hooves on hard ground, growing fainter, growing smaller, until the wagon was nothing more than a smudge of white against the long blue spine of the mountains, and then it was nothing at all. Clara Marsh sat in the dust of the Bozeman Trail. She was 16 years old. She wore a brown wool dress, a coat that had been her mother's, a pair of boots that had walked 1,000 miles, and nothing else. She had no food. She had no flint. She had no knife. She had no rifle. She had no map, no friend, no shelter, and no name that anyone for 50 miles would recognize. The nearest settlement was a place called Bozeman, 43 miles to the northeast. The temperature was already dropping. By dawn, it would be 10 degrees colder than it was now. Most men who found themselves alone on the high plains in mid-November did not last 3 days. She was not a man. She picked up the blanket. She folded it once carefully, the way her mother had taught her, and she pressed it against her chest, and she stood up. Her legs were unsteady, but they held her. She brushed the dust from her skirt with hands that were already going numb at the tips. And then, because there was nothing else to do, because there was no one to argue with, and no one to weep to, she turned and looked at the country around her. There was a reason the wagon trains had carved their road through this particular valley. There always was. Where men drove their oxen, they followed water and timber, and the bones of older trails laid down by older travelers. And this valley had all three. To the west, the slopes climbed up toward dark stands of lodgepole pine. To the north, a line of cottonwoods marked where a creek ran cold and clean from somewhere higher in the hills. The sun was already leaning toward the western peaks. She had perhaps 3 hours of light. Then the cold would come down off the mountains the way it always did, slow and patient and absolute, and it would find her wherever she stood. She began to walk toward the cottonwoods. A man might have screamed. A man might have shaken his fist at the empty road and cursed the God who had let his father throw him out. Clara did neither. She did not have the breath to spare. What she had instead, what she carried inside her like a small hot coal she had been guarding for a very long time, was something her father had never noticed and would never have understood. Clara Marsh had been watching. For 6 months on the wagon train while the men talked of cattle and the women talked of Pennsylvania, and the children played with sticks in the dust at the noon halts, Clara had watched. She had watched the wheelwright repair a cracked axle with a green ash splint and a band of hot iron. She had watched the blacksmith hold a horseshoe in his tongs until it glowed the color of a sunset, and she had memorized the angle at which he struck it. She had watched a Swedish family build their first shelter on the prairie out of nothing but cut sod and patience layering the squares of grassy earth, the way another woman might lay courses of brick. She had watched the way the trail boss read the weather in the morning sky. She had watched most of all an old German stonemason named Heinrich Voss. Voss had been almost 70 with hands like roots and a beard the color of dirty snow, and he had spent the long evenings around the wagon train fires trying to explain something he called a Katchelaufen, a masonry heater, a great stone stove with serpentine channels for the smoke to wander through, so that the heat of a single fire could be stored in the rock itself and released slowly for 18 or 20 hours after the flames had died. The other men had laughed at him. The other women had drifted away to mind their cooking pots. A masonry stove, they said. Imagine that. A whole stone wall just to warm one little room. Nonsense from the old country. Clara had not laughed. Clara had sat in the dust by the fire night after night, knees drawn up under her chin, and she had listened to every word the old man said. She walked now toward the cottonwoods with her father's voice in her head, the voice he had used the night before he threw her out. Educated women bring nothing but trouble to a homestead. He had said it, standing in the firelight, holding the family Bible he had forbidden her to read aloud to her sisters. His thumb pressed against a page she had been showing the younger girls because she wanted them to know what their own mother's name looked like, written down. Dorothy. Her mother's name had been Dorothy. He had torn the page out and thrown it in the fire while the girls cried. He had not spoken to Clara for the rest of the night, and in the morning he had pulled back the canvas flap. She reached the creek as the sun was beginning to touch the western peaks. The water ran clear and cold over a bed of round, dark stones, and she knelt and drank until her stomach ached, and her breath came in white plumes. Spring-fed, she thought. The water was so cold it could only come from somewhere high. That was good. That meant the creek would not freeze entirely, not at the bottom, not even in the deep months. Where there was water that did not freeze, there would be life. She walked downstream until she found a place where the bank cut sharply into the earth. An overhang of soil, and exposed roots maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. It was not a shelter. It was barely an idea of a shelter. But it would block the wind. She gathered an armload of deadfall branches from the brush along the creek, dragging them in clumsy bundles, and she piled them along the open side of the cut bank. The work warmed her. The light died as she labored. By the time she had built a wall of branches thick enough to break the wind, the stars were coming out, and the temperature had fallen so far that she could feel the small hairs in her nostrils freezing each time she inhaled. She crawled into the cut bank. She pulled the blanket up over her shoulders and over her head. She tucked her knees against her chest. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. The cold came for her, the way her father had come for her quietly, and without warning, and it found every gap in her clothing and every place where the blanket did not quite reach. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes, then her face until she could not feel her own mouth when she pressed her lips together. Her body began to shake so violently that her teeth chattered against one another, like dice in a cup, and there was a long, terrible hour when she understood with perfect clarity that this was how people died. not in some dramatic moment, not in a flash of pain, just like this, a slow surrender to a cold that did not hate them, that did not even know them, that simply was. She did not surrender. She counted. She counted to 1,000 and started over. She counted the wagons in the train she had left behind 11. She counted the times she had helped her mother prepare a meal. Before her mother had died of the lung sickness when Clara was 8 years old, and she lost count somewhere past 4,000 and started again. She counted the wheel repairs she had watched on the trail 17. She counted the times her father had told her she would never amount to anything, and she stopped counting that one because it had no end. She thought about her mother. Dorothy Marsh had been a Shawnee woman from Ohio, though no one in the family had ever spoken that word in Elias Marsh's hearing after the wedding. She had been a quiet woman with strong hands and a habit of looking at the world as if it were a problem to be solved rather than endured. She had taught Clara in those few years she had with her that panic was the enemy. "The cold is not your enemy," her mother had said, once kneeling beside a frozen rain barrel behind their cabin in Pennsylvania. "The cold is just the cold. Your enemy is the part of you that wants to lie down." Clara did not lie down. When the gray light of dawn finally began to seep into the eastern sky, she crawled out of the cut bank on hands and knees, and she stood up, and she found that she was still alive. Her fingers worked after a fashion. Her face burned with returning blood. Her shoulders ached as if she had been beaten with sticks. She was alive. That she understood with sudden and absolute clarity was the first problem solved. The second problem was that she could not solve any more problems if she did not eat. She spent that first full day learning the country around her. She walked the creek upstream until she found a pool deep enough that a fish might shelter there in the winter months. She marked the standing dead pines on the slope, the ones that would give her dry fuel if she could ever find a way to make fire. She followed a game trail through the brush and found fresh elk droppings still soft, which meant the animals were moving through this valley even now. She found an outcrop of pale sandstone that broke into flat slabs when she pried at it with a stout stick, and she stood for a long time looking at those slabs, the way another girl might have looked at a chest of gold coins. By dusk, she had eaten nothing. She had drunk creek water until her belly was tight, and she had walked perhaps 4 miles in slow loops around the cut bank, but she had eaten nothing. The second night was colder than the first. She estimated from the brittleness of the air and the way the creek now had a rim of ice along its quiet edges that it had dropped to 6 degrees above zero. She wedged herself deeper into the cut bank. She pulled the blanket tighter, and she thought about Heinrich Voss. She thought about the Katschelaufen. She thought about thermal mass, the words Voss had used over and over again in his thick old country accent, his blunt fingers tracing serpentine paths in the dust beside the fire. "The smoke goes through the stone," he had said. "Through the stone, not over it. The stone drinks the heat. The stone holds the heat. The stone gives the heat back. And the fire, my friends, the fire is small. The fire is small, but the warmth is long. A conventional fireplace," he had said, threw 80% of its heat straight up the chimney and into the cold sky. A proper masonry heater kept 70% of that heat inside the stone, inside the room, inside the body of the man or woman or child who sat against it through the long blue dark. Clara had thought at the time that he was just a lonely old man trying to make himself interesting around a stranger's fire. Now, lying in the cut bank with her teeth chattering, she understood. He had not been lonely. He had been trying to save lives. He had spent his last good years trying to give away a piece of knowledge that the world refused to take. She pressed her hands between her thighs to warm them, and she remembered something else. She remembered the Bible. The family Bible had ridden in a wooden chest under the wagon's bench seat. It was the one book her father had carried out of Pennsylvania. And it was the one book he forbade his daughters to open without his permission, because he believed in the iron way. He believed all things that women who read for themselves came to bad ends. Clara had read it anyway, many times, late at night by candle stub when the rest of the family slept. And in the back of that Bible, in the blank pages that printers always left bound in at the rear, Clara had been keeping a secret. She had begun it 3 months into the journey. She had taken a piece of charcoal from the cook fire one night while her father snored, and she had crept to the wagon bench, and she had opened the Bible to those blank pages at the back, and she had begun to copy down line by line and angle by angle every diagram that Heinrich Voss had drawn in the dust beside the fire. The footprint of a Katschelaufen, the serpentine channels, the firebox, the damper, the way the smoke had to climb and turn and climb and turn again, traveling 15 feet through stone before it ever reached the sky. The numbers Voss had recited under his breath as if praying. 2 feet wide at the firebox mouth, 18 inches tall, 1 square foot of chimney exit, 15 feet of vertical rise. She had filled 4 pages in tiny, careful charcoal lines. She had hidden the Bible at the bottom of the chest, and she had said nothing to anyone. And she had waited for a day she could not have named, a day she did not even know she was waiting for. The Bible had been thrown out of the wagon with her. It lay even now in the dust beside her, wrapped in the gray blanket she had picked up off the trail. Her father had thrown her out with the very thing that could save her life. And he had not known. He had not known. He had thought he was casting his daughter into the wilderness with nothing. And he had instead, by the cruel small mercy of a man's own ignorance, handed her the only key that fit the lock. She was about to spend the winter trying to open. Clara Marsh, 16 years old, lying in a cut bank on the Bozeman Trail with her fingers going numb, and the temperature falling towards 0, began very quietly to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was not even a sane sound. But it was the first thing she had done since the wagon had disappeared that was not pure animal endurance, and she laughed for a long time, and then she fell silent, and then she slept for an hour, and then she woke and did not sleep again. On the morning of the 3rd day, she found the rabbit. It was lying under a clump of sage about 200 yards downstream from the cutbank, and it had been killed by a hawk that had then been frightened off the kill before it could feed. The body was still soft. The neck was broken. She picked it up with shaking hands. She carried it back to the creek. She built a small platform of green willow branches over the running water, and she laid the rabbit on the platform, and she let the cold creek wash the body for a long time while she sat on the bank and watched it, the way another girl might have watched a great-aunt's funeral procession. She did not have fire. She ate the rabbit raw. She did not let herself think about what she was doing. She tore the meat with her teeth, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to chew jerky on long days, and she swallowed in small, careful bites and waited each time to make sure her stomach would hold what she had given it. The taste was iron and grass and cold water. It was the taste of being alive. By the time she had finished, her hands were stained and her face was stained and her belly hurt with the unfamiliar weight of food, and the shaking had stopped for the first time in 3 days. She washed her face in the creek. She washed her hands. She wrapped what remained of the rabbit in a scrap of cloth torn from her own petticoat, and she carried it back to the cut bank. And she sat in the pale sun and thought. She had food for 1 more day. She had a blanket. She had a Bible with 4 pages of charcoal diagrams hidden in the back. She had a creek and a stand of pines and a vein of flat sandstone, and a body that against every reasonable expectation was still working. She did not have fire. For the next 2 days, she searched for flint. She walked every outcrop within a mile of the cutbank, and she found sandstone and granite and a thin, pale vein of quartz. But she found no flint. And the friction methods she remembered from the Pennsylvania farm boys, the bow drill and the hand drill. Those were trades that took strong, dry fingers and dry wood, and 100 hours of practice she did not have. She tried anyway. She tried until her palms bled. She tried until the pieces of cottonwood bark she was using as a hearthboard were dark with sweat and blood and tears, and the only smoke she produced was the smoke of her own frustration. On the 5th day, she found salvation in the dust beside the trail. It was a piece of broken glass, the bottom of a bottle, thick and curved, sitting half buried in the frozen ruts the wagons had cut a year or a month or a week before. It looked at first like nothing, like trash. She almost walked past it, and then she stopped, because she remembered something her mother had once shown her with a piece of broken jar lid behind their kitchen in Pennsylvania. The way curved glass could catch the sun, the way it could focus the light into a single hot point, smaller than the head of a pin. She picked the glass up. She turned it in her fingers. She looked through it at the sun, and she saw the bright, trembling point of light bloom on the back of her own thumb, and she felt it begin to burn before she pulled her hand away. She walked back to the cutbank. She shredded a handful of dry cottonwood bark into a soft, pale bird's nest of tinder. She knelt in a patch of sun that was already beginning to thin as the afternoon advanced, and she held the glass above the tinder, and she moved it slowly, finding the focus, and a tiny brown spot began to darken in the heart of the nest, and then a wisp of smoke rose thin as a thread, and Clara Marsh did not move and did not breathe, and did not let the glass tremble for the next 3 hours of her life. 3 hours. She knelt in the cold until her knees were beyond pain, until they were simply numb, and the sun crept across the sky, and she crept with it, never letting the bright, trembling point of light leave the small brown spot. And at last, in a moment, she would remember more clearly than her own wedding day. A single, small orange ember opened in the heart of the tinder like an eye. She bent her face to it. She breathed on it, gentle as a mother breathing on a sleeping child. She breathed, and her head went light, and the world began to swim, and the ember grew, and a small yellow flame leapt up, and she fed it. Cottonwood bark, and then a twig, and then another twig, and she made fire for the first time in 5 days, and she put her face very close to the small yellow flame, and she wept without making any sound at all. That night she cooked what was left of the rabbit. She slept beside the fire, waking every hour to feed it, and when she woke in the false dawn, the coals were still warm under their gray ash, and the first thing she did before water, before food, before anything else was take the family Bible from inside her coat and open it to the blank pages at the back. The charcoal diagrams were still there. Heinrich Voss's Kasselofen sketched in her own careful hand 3 months of stolen midnight effort, hidden in a book her father had thrown into the wilderness with her, without ever knowing what she had put inside it. She traced a finger along the serpentine channels. She mouthed the numbers under her breath. 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, 15 feet of vertical rise, thermal mass. The stone drinks the heat. The stone holds the heat. The stone gives the heat back. She closed the Bible. She wrapped it in the gray blanket, and she stood up and she stretched, and she felt the small, terrible joy of a person who has been given a hand of cards she did not expect to be dealt. And she looked at the country around her, and she began for the first time to plan. For the next 7 days, from the 19th of November through the 26th, Clara Marsh did almost nothing but walk and look. She walked the valley from one end to the other. She climbed the lower slopes of the western ridge. She marked every standing dead pine in her head, every outcrop of usable stone, every game trail, every spring, every patch of ground that lay too low and would flood when the snowmelt came. She built no shelter beyond the cut bank. She built nothing at all. She was hunting, but not for game. She was hunting for the right place. She found it on the afternoon of the 26th, a quarter-mile upstream from the cut bank where the valley narrowed and the western slope rose more sharply. She pushed through a screen of young fir and stopped, and the breath went out of her in a single long white plume. It was a natural alcove cut into the hillside. The earth on three sides had been undercut ages ago by some long-vanished spring or some old shift of the slope, and what remained was a deep half-cave, perhaps 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide, floored with packed earth and small loose stones. The opening faced south. The winter sun, even at this latitude, would pour in through that opening for the better part of every clear day. The hillside above and behind would act as a thermal mass all its own, a great patient body of earth that would never freeze through, never thaw, never move. A man could build a front wall across that opening and a roof to close it in, and he would have not a cabin but a kind of human den, an earth-sheltered cabin half buried in the slope of the mountain itself. A man could. Clara Marsh stood at the mouth of that alcove and understood with a calm that almost frightened her that she could too. She walked into the alcove. She knelt and brushed loose stones from the earth floor. She looked at the back wall, at the side walls, at the place where the roof line would need to meet the front frame. She turned in a slow circle, and as she turned, her boot kicked something that made a small dry sound, not the sound of a stone, and she stopped and looked down. It was a boot. A man's boot. Old leather, badly worn at the heel, the lace long since rotted away. It lay on its side under a thin drift of wind-blown dirt and pine needles. And beside it, when she knelt and brushed the debris aside, lay a piece of plank board, perhaps 6 inches by 10, weathered gray. The board had been broken at one end. The other end was clean. There were words burned into the clean end of the board. Clara held the board up to the light. The letters had been made with the point of a knife and the patient pressure of a man with hours to spare, and they were faint, but they were legible. Built wrong. Died warm enough to know it. She read it 3 times. She did not move for a long while. The wind sighed through the firs above the alcove. Somewhere on the slope behind her, a stone fell dislodged by nothing she could see, and rolled a few feet and stopped. She turned the board over in her hands. She set it down. She picked up the boot. The leather was hard with old cold, and inside it, when she tipped it, she found nothing but dry pine needles and the brittle, papery husk of an insect that had died there many seasons ago. She set the boot down beside the board. Someone had come here before her. Someone had stood in this same alcove, had seen perhaps what she had just seen, the southern exposure, the earth on 3 sides, the perfect natural pocket of shelter. Someone had built here. Someone had built and had failed and had lived just long enough to understand why he was dying. Built wrong. Died warm enough to know it. He had warmed himself just barely enough to keep his fingers working at the end, just barely enough to find a piece of plank and a knife and the will to leave a message for whoever came next. And then he had died, and the snow had come, and the spring had come, and the seasons had taken him piece by piece, until there was nothing left of him but a single worn-out boot and 10 words of warning carved on a board. Clara Marsh sat down in the dirt of the alcove. She did not weep. She had not wept since the rabbit. She held the board in her lap, and she thought very carefully about the man who had carved it. She thought about how he had been right in the most important way. He had been right that this was the place. He had read the land, He had read the slope and the sun, and the way the wind cut around the shoulder of the hill, and he had chosen well. What he had not had, what he had not been given, what no one in the wide, cold West had bothered to give him, was the knowledge of how a stone could hold heat through a long blue night. He had built a fire. The fire had risen the way fires do straight up the chimney, of whatever poor flue he had managed to throw together, and it had taken his warmth with it. And he had sat by the dying embers as the cold came down off the mountain, and somewhere in those last hours he had understood. He had understood that the problem was not the wood, and not the will, and not even the cold. The problem was the chimney. The problem was that no one had ever told him about thermal mass. Clara reached inside her coat. She drew out the family Bible. She held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling the dry leather of the cover, and the dry pages and the small dry weight of the 4 blank sheets at the back that were not blank at all. "I have what you didn't," she said. She did not say it out loud. She said it to the man who had carved the board wherever he was now, in whatever country the dead of this country went to. "I have what you didn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry no one gave it to you. But I have it. And I am going to build it. And I am going to live." She put the Bible back inside her coat. She picked up the boot and the board, and she carried them out of the alcove, and she found a place under a young fir tree near the entrance, and she scraped a shallow grave in the half-frozen earth with the edge of a flat stone. She laid the boot in the grave. She laid the board on top of the boot, words down, so that the carving lay against the leather like a hand resting on a shoulder. She covered them with dirt and pine needles. She placed a single flat stone on top of the small mound the way she had once seen her mother do for a stillborn child of a neighbor back in Pennsylvania. She stood up. She walked back into the alcove. She stood at its center and turned in a slow circle, and she looked at the back wall, and the side walls, and the roof line, and the place where her front wall would have to go, and she began in her head to dig. The temperature that night dropped to 12 degrees above zero. She slept by a fire she had built at the mouth of the alcove, a real fire now fed by armloads of standing dead pine she had dragged in over the course of the afternoon, and she dreamed of stone. She dreamed of long serpentine channels curling through a wall the color of old bone. She dreamed of a fire so small you could cup it in your hands, and a warmth so long that it lasted from one dawn to the next. When she woke in the gray cold of morning, she pried up a flat stone from the bed of the creek, and she sharpened its edge against a harder stone, and she began to dig the foundation trench. It was the 26th of November, 1873. She had perhaps 3 weeks before the real snow came down. She had a body that was already lean from a month of near starvation and would only grow leaner. She had a single thin blanket. She had a piece of broken glass with which to make fire on clear days, and an unreliable scatter of embers she would have to nurse through every cloudy one. She had no tools beyond what she could sharpen from stone. She had no help. She had no neighbors, no friends, no name that anyone in this valley had yet bothered to learn. She had a Bible with 4 pages of charcoal diagrams hidden in the back. She had a memory of an old German stonemason no one had listened to. She had her mother's voice faint now, but still in her saying the cold is just the cold. Your enemy is the part of you that wants to lie down. And she had a single new piece of knowledge given to her by a stranger. She would never meet a man whose name she did not know, and would never know who had failed in this same alcove, and had used his last warmth to leave her a warning. Built wrong, died warm enough to know it. She would not build wrong. She knelt at the foundation line she had scratched into the earth with the edge of her stone. She drove the stone down into the cold dirt. She pried up the first clod. She set it aside. She drove the stone down again. Behind her, in the half-light of the alcove, the small mound under the young fir tree caught a thin gray bar of sunrise. Above her, on the high blue ridges, the first real snow clouds of the long Montana winter were beginning to gather. Ahead of her stretched 3 weeks of work. No 16-year-old girl had any business doing 3 weeks that would either kill her or change everything about who she had been told she was allowed to become. She drove the stone down again, and again, and again. The third day of December came in cold and bright, with a sky so high and pale, it looked as if a man could have driven a nail into it. Clara Marsh had been working at the foundation trench for a week. Her hands, which had once held a charcoal stub and traced a German stonemason's diagrams by candlelight, were now the hands of a laborer twice her age. The skin across her knuckles had cracked open and scabbed over and cracked again. Her nails were torn down to the quick. Her palms were a single hard mat of yellow callus, and underneath the callus, when she pressed her thumb against her own wrist, at the end of a day she could feel the small ropey strength of new muscle that had not been there a month before. She had dug a trench 3 feet deep across the entire 15-foot mouth of the alcove. She had dug it with a flat stone sharpened on a harder stone, and with the broken half of an old wagon spoke she had found bleached on the slope above the creek, and with her own raw fingers when those other tools failed her. The trench bottomed out on a layer of dark granite that the slope itself had laid down a long time before any man had ever come to look at it, and Clara had read that granite shelf the way another woman might have read a letter from a long-absent husband. Here is the floor of the world. Here is what you will build upon. Build true. She had begun to fit stones into the trench. The flat slabs of sandstone she had pried from the outcrop a quarter mile down the creek, dragged one at a time on a sledge of green willow branches. She had lashed together with strips of bark, each stone weighing 20 or 30 or 40 pounds, each stone setting her shoulders on fire by the time she had wrestled it into place. She fitted them tight. She read each stone with her hands before she set it, the way Heinrich Voss had once told her a good mason did, finding the natural face of the rock, finding the side that wanted to lie down, and the side that wanted to stand up. She mortared them with clay she had dug from a seam in the creek bank and mixed with sand and a little dry grass to keep it from cracking when it dried. It was not beautiful work. She had no plumb line and no level. She had only her own eye and the eye of a 16-year-old girl who has been hungry for a month. Is not the eye of a master mason. But the joints were tight. The courses were level enough. The foundation sat down into the trench like a thing that meant to stay there. She had just lifted a 40-pound slab into its place at the western end of the foundation when she heard the mule. She did not stop working. She did not look up. She had learned in the long days alone that sounds in this country carried a long way and meant many things. And a person who jerked her head at every distant noise was a person who would never get her shoulders back down into the work. She fitted the slab. She tapped it with the flat of her palm to settle it. She troweled clay into the joint with a flat sliver of bark she had been using as a mortaring blade. She turned her head at last only when the sound of the hooves had come close enough that she could hear the soft creak of saddle leather behind them. A man on a mule had come up the creek trail and was sitting now, perhaps 30 yards out, watching her. He was an old man, not old the way Heinrich Voss had been, old soft at the edges and gentle in the eye, but old the way an axe handle is old, dried hard and weathered gray, and unlikely to break under any load that had not already broken it. He was in his late 50s, Clara guessed. His coat was a heavy oiled canvas the color of dirty straw. His beard was iron gray and trimmed close. His hat had been black once and was now the color of road dust. He sat his mule the way a man sits a horse when he has been sitting horses since he was a child, balanced and easy, and he did not move and did not speak for a long minute, while Clara wiped clay from her hands on her skirt and waited for him to choose what he would do next. He chose to dismount. He swung down stiffly as a man past 50 does in cold weather, and he tied the mule to a young fir without looking at the knot, and he walked over to the foundation trench and stopped at the edge of it and looked down. He looked for a long time. He knelt. He put one bare hand against the top course of fitted sandstone. He moved his hand slowly along the joint between two stones, feeling the tightness, feeling the way the clay had been pressed and not just smeared. He stood up again. He looked at the alcove. He looked at the sledge of green willow branches. He looked at the small fire Clara had banked under a rock overhang, kept alive now for 2 solid weeks, since the day of the broken glass. He looked at the gray blanket folded on a flat stone, with the worn family Bible tucked carefully inside it. And then he looked at Clara, and Clara understood with a small, sharp clarity she had not felt since the morning the wagon had not turned around, that she was being read the way she had been reading the stones. "You're the girl," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. There was an accent in it faint as the smell of pine on a man's coat after he has come in from the woods. German, she thought. Not Voss's thick, old country German. Something closer to American, smoothed down by years of speaking English, in a country where no one had cared to hear his other tongue. "Yes, sir," she said. "The one that wagon put off." "Yes, sir." He nodded once, as a man nods when a thing he had heard turns out to be true. He looked again at the foundation. He looked again at her hands. He did not. She noticed look at her face for long, which she understood even at 16 to be a courtesy from a certain kind of older man to a young woman alone in the wilderness. "My name is Otto Schreiber," he said. "I have a place 7 miles north along this creek. 3 years now. I heard about you 4 days ago from a Sioux trader who passed my fence line and said there was a white girl building a stone wall in the alcove above the cottonwoods. I did not believe him until this morning when I rode out to see for myself." "My name is Clara Marsh," Clara said. "I am pleased to meet you, Mr. Schreiber." The old farmer almost smiled. It did not quite reach his mouth, but it touched his eyes for a moment, and Clara understood that this was a man who had been expecting to find a corpse and was instead being introduced to a person. "You plan to winter here?" he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Well, in this. He looked at the foundation. He looked at the alcove. He looked at the sky. The pale, high sky said nothing, but Otto Schreiber read it anyway, and what he read there did not seem to make him happy. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 2.5. Then the heavy snow comes down off the Absarokas, and a man does not work outside for more than an hour at a time without losing a finger. You know this. I know it. You think you can put up a wall and a roof and a chimney in 2 weeks? Yes, sir. With what tools? With these, Clara said, and she lifted her hands. The old farmer looked at her hands. He looked at them for a long time, the cracked knuckles, the yellow callus, the torn nails. And Clara watched his eyes and watched his mouth and could not read what he saw there. Then he said quietly, "Where did you learn to set stone like that?" Clara hesitated. The hesitation surprised her. She had not realized until that moment that she had been guarding the answer to that question, the way a man guards a small bag of coin on a long road. But Otto Schreiber had asked it plainly, and the time for guarding had perhaps run out. "From an old mason in our wagon train," she said. "A German. He was always trying to tell us about thermal mass, about a masonry stove he called a Katcheloffen." The men laughed at him. I did not laugh. Otto Schreiber went very still. He went still the way a deer goes still in the moment before it understands what it is looking at. He did not move. He did not breathe in any way Clara could see. The wind sighed through the firs above the alcove. Somewhere above them on the slope, a pine cone fell and clicked twice as it bounced. "What was his name?" he said. His voice had changed. There was something in it now that had not been there a moment before, a thinness as if he had spoken from a slightly greater distance. "Heinrich Voss," Clara said. Otto Schreiber closed his eyes. He closed them as a man closes his eyes when he is being told a piece of news he has been bracing for. And when he opened them again, the iron-gray gaze was still steady. But it was wet at the corners the way the eyes of older men sometimes go wet. In a cold wind, only there was no wind in the alcove just then. "Heinrich Voss," he said. "Yes, sir." Was a man I knew. Clara did not speak. She felt, without quite understanding why, that the next words in this conversation were not hers to choose. Otto Schreiber walked to a flat stone at the edge of the alcove and sat down on it, as a tired man sits with both hands on his knees. He did not look at her. He looked instead at the foundation trench, at the careful courses of fitted sandstone running across the mouth of the alcove, and he spoke to the stones and not to Clara. "He came west in '71, he said, 2 years before you. We had known each other in Milwaukee before the war, before all of it. He was a master mason in the old country, Stuttgart. He built Katcheloffens for 40 years. He came to America because his wife had family in Milwaukee, and his wife died in '68. And after she died, he could not bear the city anymore. He said he wanted to come to a place where a man could be useful. He thought he would teach. He thought the homesteaders out here would want to learn how to keep their cabins warm without burning a whole cord of wood every week." The old farmer paused. He drew a breath. "They did not want to learn," he said. "No, sir," Clara said quietly. "They did not." "He came up to my place in October of last year, October of '72. He had spent a year going from claim to claim along this part of the territory, trying to give his knowledge away, and not one man had taken it. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was an old foreigner with strange ideas. He stayed a week with me. We drank coffee. He showed me his drawings. He said he had decided to build one himself. A small one in his own cabin, just to prove the thing could be done in this country with this stone and this clay. He said when he had built it, men would come and see, and then they would believe. He went home to his claim. His claim was about 9 miles west of mine on a fork of the Yellowstone." Otto Schreiber stopped. He looked down at his hands. "He died in January of this year," he said, "of '73. I rode out to him in February when I had not heard from him in too long. I found him in his cabin. He was on the floor by the firebox of a Katcheloffen he had not finished. There were stones stacked beside it that he had not yet set. There was clay in a bucket that had frozen and split the bucket. He had a chisel in his hand. He had died of a thing in his chest, I think. His heart, maybe. The Katcheloffen had never been lit. Not even once. He had been so close. Another week of work, maybe 2. And then the cold had come, and the work had broken him, and he had sat down by the unfinished stove, and he had not gotten up again. The old farmer was silent for a long time. "I buried him on his claim," he said at last. "I marked it with a stone. I rode back to my own place, and I told my wife about it, and she cried. And I did not cry, because I am not a man who cries easily. But I have thought about Heinrich Voss almost every day since. I thought he had died with all of it inside him. Every drawing, every number, every long fool's hope. I thought no one had been listening. He looked up. He looked at Clara Marsh, 16 years old, with the calloused hands and the cracked lips and the worn family Bible folded inside a gray blanket on a flat stone behind her. And Otto Schreiber's iron gray eyes were wet now, in a way no wind could explain. "You were listening," he said. Clara could not speak for a moment. The wind moved through the firs. "Yes, sir," she said. "All those nights by the fire. All those nights, sir." "He never told me," Otto said. "He never wrote me. He never said in any letter that there was anyone who heard him." "I do not think he knew, sir." "No," Otto said. "No, he would not have. He was that kind of man. He talked to the air and trusted the air to remember." He stood up. He stood up slowly, the way he had sat down with both hands on his knees in the careful management of an old man's joints in a cold morning. He walked to the foundation trench. He stood at the edge of it. He looked at the courses of fitted sandstone, and at the alcove behind them, and at the place where the front wall would have to go. And Clara watched his face and understood without being told that the old farmer was not looking at her foundation anymore. He was looking at the unfinished firebox of his old friend Heinrich Voss, 9 miles west on a fork of the Yellowstone, and he was seeing, perhaps, for the first time, that the work had not died with the man. "I have an axe head at my place," he said. His voice was rough, but it was steady. "No handle. The handle broke last spring and I never got around to making a new one. You could carve one out of green ash. I have a piece of green ash in my barn. I have a broken saw, too. The blade is broken halfway down. About 12 inches of good steel left. You could cut a lot with 12 inches of good steel if you were careful. And I have, I suppose, some salt pork I could spare. A few pounds. My wife will not miss it. We have done well this year." "Mr. Schreiber," Clara began. "You will pay me back in the spring," he said. He said it firmly, the way a man cuts off a road he does not want to travel down. "You will not pay me back in any other way. You will not thank me. I am not doing this for you. No, sir. I am doing this for him. Yes, sir." He looked at her one more time. He looked at her as a man looks at a younger person who has been given a thing. The older person knows the weight of, and does not yet. And his face for a moment was unguarded. And Clara saw in that one moment that Otto Schreiber was a man who had buried more friends than he had ever expected to bury, and who was against his own will taking out one more grave in his heart and putting a small new flame inside it. "Do not die, Clara Marsh," he said. "I have enough ghosts on this creek without adding yours." He walked to his mule. He untied it. He swung up. He rode away down the creek trail without looking back, and the dust of the trail rose behind the mule's hooves and settled, and the wind moved through the firs, and Clara Marsh stood at the edge of her foundation trench with both her hands pressed flat against the worn front of her coat, and did not move for a long time. When she finally turned back to her work, she was no longer building only a cabin. She was building a grave marker for a man she had never met, and a flame that 9 miles of winter country and a year of cold had not been able to put out, and a promise to a dead German mason who had spent his last evenings on this earth, talking to the air and trusting the air to remember. The air, it turned out, had remembered. Otto Schreiber came back the next morning with the axe head and the broken saw and a small clean cloth sack with 3 pounds of salt pork in it, and a folded note from his wife that said, "Only God keep you, child," in a careful schoolhouse hand. He did not stay. He set the things down at the edge of the alcove. He looked once at the foundation, nodded once, and rode away. Clara fitted the axe head to a green ash handle she carved with her own teeth, and the broken saw, and the patience of a girl who had learned that patience was the only currency she possessed in unlimited supply. By nightfall, she could fell a tree. By the 8th of December, she had the front wall frame standing. It was a double frame, an inner ring of straight lodgepole pine logs about 6 inches through, and an outer ring set 4 feet beyond it, with the 4 feet of cavity between them, ready to be packed solid with fitted stones and clay and packed earth. It was not engineering anyone had taught her. It was a thing she had reasoned out of the cold, sitting in the cut-bank in the long, shaking nights, working backward from the principle Heinrich Voss had given her. Thermal mass. If stone could hold the heat of a fire, then a wall of stone could hold the heat of a cabin, and a wall of stone 4 feet thick, packed between 2 log frames that would protect it from wet and wind, could hold that heat all night and most of the next day. The inner frame would carry the roof. The outer frame would shield the mass. The mass between would do the work. On the 11th of December, a second visitor came up the creek. He came on a tall bay horse, a man of perhaps 42 years, clean-shaven in a long dark coat that had been brushed that morning. He sat his horse like an officer. He had been an officer, in fact, though Clara did not know it yet. His name was Edmund Hale, and he had served 4 years as an engineering officer in the Union Army of the Potomac, and he had taken up a claim 5 miles west of the alcove the previous summer. And he had built himself a proper log cabin with a proper conventional fireplace. And he was a man who was used to being in any gathering of 2 or more the person who knew the most, and who knew. He swung down. He looped his reins around a fur. He walked over to the work site without waiting to be invited, the way a man walks who has been an officer. And he stood at the foundation and looked at it and then at the standing frame, and Clara saw his face the way a person sees a hand of cards being laid down on a table one by one. He saw the foundation. The corner of his mouth moved, not impressed but not dismissive. Reading it, he saw the frame. The corner of his mouth moved again the other way, now skeptical. He saw the rough chimney footing she had begun to lay in the back corner of the alcove, the great square base of fitted stone that would carry eventually 4 feet of width and 6 feet of depth and 12 feet of height of solid masonry. The corner of his mouth went down. He turned and looked at her. "Young lady," he said, "may I speak frankly?" "Yes, sir," Clara said. "There are 4 things wrong with what you are doing here." "Yes, sir." "First," Edmund Hale said, holding up one gloved finger, "that chimney, when you build it as high as I think you intend to build it, will weigh at a rough calculation somewhere between 8 and 10 tons of stone. Your foundation under it does not appear to me to be adequate. It will settle in the spring thaw. It will crack. It will in all likelihood collapse." He held up a second finger. "Second, you are intending, I see, to build the firebox of common sandstone. Sandstone cannot take that kind of heat. It cracks. It spalls. It will fail within a season. A proper firebox is built of firebrick. You have no firebrick. Therefore, you have in essence no firebox." Third finger. "Third, even if your foundation holds and your firebox holds, you have no way of knowing whether the draft of your serpentine flue will draw. Draft is not a guess, young lady. It is a calculation. The cross-sectional area of the firebox opening, the cross-sectional area of the chimney exit, the vertical rise of the stack, The number and angle of the bends in the smoke path. A flue that cannot draw is a flue that smokes you out of your own house, or in cold weather with the door shut suffocates you in your sleep. Fourth finger. And fourth, you are building into the side of a hill. In April or May, when the snowpack on this slope begins to melt, you will have water coming down through this alcove like a river. You will be standing knee-deep in mud inside your own cabin. Your walls will sag. Your mortar will fail. The hillside above you may, depending on the soils, give way altogether and bury you and your chimney and your cachalofen if it is still standing in 20 feet of mountain. He lowered his hand. He looked at her with the steady, patient face of a man who has spent the last 20 years of his life being right about things in front of younger men, and who has come now into a strange small wilderness to be right about a thing in front of a 16-year-old girl, and who does not particularly enjoy the task, but considers it a duty all the same. Now, he said, I am not telling you these things to discourage you. I am telling you because I think you have a great deal of courage, and I would prefer that your courage not kill you. I have seen too many homesteads fail in this country. I do not want to ride past this alcove in April and find a girl frozen in a heap of fallen stone. So I will say to you with respect, stop. Come to my place. My wife and I have a room for you. You may stay with us until the spring. Then we will see about getting you to Bozeman or back to your family in the east or wherever else you wish to go. But do not stay here. He waited. Clara had been holding a small fitted stone in her right hand while he spoke. It was a piece of the chimney footing perhaps 4 pounds, a good clean rectangle of sandstone she had broken with her own bare blistered hands that morning. She held it now without seeming to notice it the way a sleeping child holds a doll. The wind moved through the firs. Mr. Hale, she said. Yes. You are right about the 8 to 10 tons. I figured 9. The foundation under the chimney goes down 3 feet to the granite shelf. The granite shelf you are standing on right now. That is bedrock. It is not going anywhere. The foundation does not need to hold the chimney. The mountain does. He did not speak. He looked at her. You are right about the firebox, she said. Sandstone will not last like firebrick. It will crack. It will spall the way you said. So I will not use it forever. I will use it this winter because this winter I do not have firebrick and I do have sandstone. In the spring when I can travel, I will go to Bozeman and I will find firebrick or the means to fire some clay into something like it, and I will tear out the sandstone firebox and rebuild. 1 winter of cracked stone is the cost of being alive in April. He did not speak. You are right that draft is a calculation, she said. I did the calculation. He blinked. The firebox opening is 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. That is 3 square feet. The chimney exit will be 1 square foot. The vertical rise from the top of the firebox to the cap of the stack will be 15 feet. The flue between is serpentine but not folded. 3 bends. The bends are wide. Voss said wide bends draw better than tight ones. He said the rule was that for every horizontal foot of flue, you needed a corresponding inch of additional stack height to compensate for the friction loss. I have 15 feet of horizontal travel through the channels. I have built 15 extra inches into the stack to compensate. The stack will draw, sir. It will draw because the math says it will draw. Edmund Hale's mouth had opened very slightly. And about the meltwater, she said. I dug a French drain. You did not see it because it is under the leaf litter on the back side of the alcove, but it is there. 3 feet deep, lined with gravel. It runs around the back of the cabin and out to the creek. When the snowpack comes off this slope, the water will go around me, not through me. The hillside will not give way because the slope above the alcove is laid on the same granite shelf the foundation sits on. I checked. I dug 3 test pits along the upper rim. It is one piece of rock. It is the bones of the mountain. The wind moved through the firs. Edmund Hale closed his mouth. He stood for a long time without speaking. He looked at the foundation. He looked at the frame. He looked at the alcove. He looked at the chimney footing. He looked last of all at Clara Marsh, and his face was the face of a man who had ridden up that creek with a finished speech in his mouth and was leaving with the speech in pieces in his hand. "You did the calculation," he said. "Yes, sir." "In your head?" "In my head, and on the back pages of a Bible, with a piece of charcoal." "Show me." She showed him. She unwrapped the family Bible from the gray blanket. She opened it to the back pages. She showed him the 4 pages of careful charcoal diagrams she had copied down by a candle stub on long nights when her father slept, and the small spidery numbers in her own hand, the cross-sections and the rise and the friction loss and the corrections, all of it set down by a 16-year-old girl who had been listening when no one else was listening. Edmund Hale held the Bible for a long time. He did not turn the pages quickly. He read them the way a man reads a letter from a stranger that turns out halfway through to concern him. When he gave the Bible back to her at last, he gave it back gently. He used both hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No, sir. You owe me nothing. I came up that creek prepared to instruct you. You did instruct me, sir. You confirmed every figure. That is a kind of instruction. It is the most useful kind there is." He looked at her then, Edmund Hale, union engineer, 42 years old. And Clara watched his face and saw the small, careful thing that happens inside a certain kind of older man when he realizes that the young person in front of him is not going to need his protection in the way he had planned to offer it, and that any usefulness he is going to have here will be a usefulness he has to earn rather than bestow. "You will need help raising the roof timbers," he said. "Yes, sir, I will. I will come back in 3 days. I will bring 2 men from my place. We will raise the roof in 1 afternoon. Mr. Hale, you will pay me back in the spring," he said. He smiled just barely for the first time. "Like Schreiber, we will all stand in line." He rode away. The roof went up on the 14th of December, raised in a single hard afternoon by Edmund Hale and 2 of his hired men, and Clara Marsh, who carried as much weight as any of them and said less. Straight lodgepole logs across the wall frames, a layer of bark over the logs, 8 inches of packed earth over the bark sloped to shed water, a gap at the front corner where the chimney stack would rise, framed and braced and ready. By dusk, the alcove had become for the first time a shape that resembled a house. The Catchalofen took her the next 24 hours. She built the firebox first, set down into the back corner of the cabin at floor level 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, lined with the flattest and densest sandstone she had been able to find. She built the first horizontal flue rising from the back of the firebox, running along the back wall of the cabin behind the chimney mass. At the corner, she turned it. She ran the second leg along the side wall. At the second corner, she turned it again and ran the third leg back toward the front. And there at last, she opened it into the vertical stack that climbed up through the roof and into the cold, high sky. 15 feet of horizontal travel through stone. 15 feet of vertical rise above it. 3 wide bends. Every joint mortared with creek clay mixed with sand and dry grass. And patience. On the 15th of December, with snow beginning to fall steadily outside and the temperature dropping toward 12 degrees above zero, Clara Marsh laid her first fire in the firebox of a catchalofen she had built with her own hands. She lit it with the broken bottom of a wagon train bottle and a careful bird's nest of cottonwood bark. The fire caught. It climbed. The smoke rose from the firebox into the first horizontal flue, and Clara stood with her hand on the cold stone of the chimney mass and waited for the smoke to draw through and rise up the stack. It did not. The smoke rolled back out of the firebox mouth into the cabin in a slow gray wave. Her eyes burned. She coughed. She let the small fire die. She climbed out onto the snowy roof in the failing light, and she sat astride the cold stack. And she understood calmly and without panic that her stack was 18 inches too short. The friction loss through 3 bends was greater than her calculation had predicted. She had built her correction. She had not built enough of it. She climbed down. She gathered 18 more inches of fitted stone from the pile beside the cabin. She climbed back up. In the snow and the failing light, she added 18 inches to the height of her stack, mortaring each course with cold, stiff clay that her own breath had to warm before it would set. She climbed down. She laid a second fire. The smoke rose. It climbed into the first horizontal flue. It turned. It ran along the back of the cabin, and Clara could feel with her hand pressed to the stone the slow, patient transfer of heat moving with it. It turned again at the second corner. It ran along the side. It turned a third time. It climbed the stack, and from the cap of the stack, 15.5 feet above the roof, the smoke rose into the falling snow in a clean, straight column, the color of old wool, and it kept rising, and it did not falter, and it did not roll back. And Clara Marsh stood inside her cabin with her hand on the warming chimney stone and listened to her fire make the sound. Voss had once described to her a sound he had said was like wind moving through a hollow tree, and she understood that the thing was alive. The catchalofen drew. She fed the fire for 3 hours of hard burn, the way Voss had taught her in the firelight a year ago, hot and fast with dry lodgepole to load the mass. By the time the flames began to die down, the firebox stones were radiating heat she could feel from 6 feet away. The first leg of the flue was warm to the palm. The second leg was almost as warm. By the time darkness came down on the alcove, every stone in the chimney mass, all 9 tons of it, was warm to the touch. She banked the coals. She closed the firebox opening with a flat damper stone. She sat down at last on her pallet of pine boughs on the floor of the cabin, and she pulled the gray blanket around her shoulders, and she watched the small red glow of the closed firebox in the dark. And she did not sleep for a long time. She sat with her back pressed against the warm stone of the chimney mass, and she felt the heat of it soaking through her coat into her shoulders. And she did not move for hours. And at some point, without knowing exactly when, she began to laugh again. The small dry laugh she had laughed in the cut bank a month before. She had built it. Outside, the temperature dropped to 6 below zero. Inside her cabin, 15 feet from the firebox, the air held at 48 degrees. When she woke once in the middle of the night and pressed her palm to the chimney stone, it was still warm. Near dawn, she woke again. The stone was cooler now, but still above body temperature, and the cabin still held at 38 degrees, and the small red glow inside the closed firebox had not yet died. She had used in that single firing about 1 armload of wood. A conventional fireplace on a night like that would have eaten 4. In the morning, the snow had stopped, and the world outside the cabin was a single perfect white silence. And Clara Marsh stepped out into it and stood at the door of the thing she had built and looked up at the small, clean column of smoke rising from her stack into the high blue sky. The smoke went up. The smoke kept going up. The smoke did not stop going up. Somewhere 9 miles west of her on a fork of the Yellowstone, there was a small stone she had never seen marking a small mound. She had never visited where an old German mason lay in the frozen ground, with his hands folded on his chest and his unfinished work behind him. Clara could not go to him. She did not know how to find him. But she stood at her door and she watched her smoke climb, and in her head she said quietly, the only thing she could think of to say, "Mr. Voss, it works." The smoke kept rising. Word in that country traveled the way smoke traveled. Slow at first, lifting off into the high, cold air, and then carried on the wind to places the original fire would never reach. By the 19th of December, Otto Schreiber had ridden out to see the finished cabin, and had walked through it without speaking, and had laid his old hand on the warm chimney stone, and had stood for a long time, with his eyes closed. By the 21st, a widow named Agnes Porter had come up the creek with her 2 children, and had asked Clara plainly and without ceremony to show her how the thing worked. By the 27th, a railroad surveyor named Silas Croft had ridden up from the south on a study tour of valley homesteads, had inspected the cabin with a professional eye, had told Clara that her stack would backdraft in a real blizzard unless she capped it, and had stayed 2 days to help her build the cap. Stone collar around the top, openings on all 4 sides, flat cap stone on top of the collar. Wind hits the collar instead of going straight down the pipe. They built it together in the cold, Silas Croft directing, and Clara doing most of the climbing and on. On the 2nd of January, 1874, when the wind finally came down off the northwest, with the kind of teeth that meant business, the cap Silas Croft had taught her to build was the last thing standing between Clara Marsh and the worst 3 days of her life. The blizzard hit at dusk. The wind shook the cabin walls. The snow came in sideways. The temperature in the alcove dropped to 22 below zero in the first 6 hours, and then to 26, and then to 31. Clara had fired the Catchaloffen hard that morning. 4 solid hours of dry lodgepole, all 9 tons of mass loaded to the limit. She had closed the firebox damper. She had banked the door of the cabin with packed snow from inside the way Otto Schreiber had told her to do if she was ever caught in a real one. She had set a pot of snowmelt on a flat stone near the chimney to keep her in drinking water, and she had sat down with her back against the warm stone, and she had listened to the wind try to take her cabin apart, and she had felt the Catchaloffen hold the cold at bay the way Voss had said it would, 42 degrees inside, while outside the world tried to freeze itself into a single solid block. It was on the 2nd night of the blizzard that she heard the pounding. She thought at first it was the wind. The wind had been pounding for 36 hours after all, against every plank and every stone and every joint of clay. And the small sounds of a winter storm were difficult to tell apart from one another. But the pounding came again. It was not the wind. It was a small, steady human pounding very far away, the way a man pounds with the back of an axe against a wall when he is trapped on the wrong side of it. It came from the east, from the direction, if she had read the windwrite of the Johnson family's claim, perhaps 300 yards across the snow. Clara Marsh sat up. She put her ear against the door. She listened. The pounding came again. Then it stopped. Then it came again, weaker this time. Then it stopped and did not come back for a long while, and Clara Marsh sat by her door in the dark, with the Catchaloffen still warm at her back, and understood with the slow, terrible clarity that had been her companion now for 2 months, that someone 300 yards away was beating with the last of his strength on a wall he could not break, and that no one on this earth was going to hear him but her. She rose. She took her coat. She took the gray blanket. She wound her mother's old wool scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. She took a length of rope she had braided herself from strips of green hide. Otto Schreiber had given her in November, perhaps 80 feet of it, and she tied one end to the central post of her own cabin, and she opened her door against the howling. The cold came in like a knife. She tied the other end of the rope around her own waist. She stepped out into the dark. The wind took her almost off her feet. The snow was up to her thighs in the drifts. The temperature, she would learn later from Silas Croft's thermometer, was 31 degrees below zero, and the wind chill was something no instrument in that country was built to measure. She bent into the wind. She pushed forward. She counted her steps the way she had counted in the cutbank 100 years ago. 1, 2, 3. She made 50 yards. At 50 yards, the rope ran out. She stood at the end of her tether in the dark and the howling, and she cupped her gloved hands around her scarf-wrapped mouth, and she shouted into the storm. She shouted the name of the Johnson family. She shouted that she was coming. She shouted that she had heat and shelter, and that the door was open. She shouted until her throat was raw, and her own voice was a small, thin animal sound she did not recognize, and the wind took every shout and swallowed it whole and gave back nothing. The pounding when she stopped to listen had stopped. She did not know if it had stopped because he had heard her, or because the wind was now between them, or because he could pound no more. She stood at the end of her rope for a long time. She stood until her face went numb beneath the scarf. She stood until her gloved hands inside her sleeves were beyond feeling. She did the calculation in her head the way she had done every calculation for 2 months now. 80 feet of rope, 220 feet still to go. No second rope, no way to anchor a new one, no way to find her own door again if she let go of this one. 2 lives in the balance. Hers certain if she turned back now. His almost certainly already gone if she did not. She did not let go of the rope. She turned around. She walked back along the rope hand over hand with the wind now at her back, driving her toward her own door. And she did not weep because tears would have frozen on her face and blinded her. And she stepped at last across her own threshold and shut the door behind her and barred it. And she stood in the warm dark of her cabin with her hands still on the rope and her back against the door, and the catchaloffen still radiating its slow, long heat into the room. She slid down the door. She sat on the cold, packed earth of her own floor in the warm dark beside the warm stone. And she put her face in her cold hands, and she made a sound she would not be able to describe to anyone ever for the rest of her life. The blizzard lasted another day. On the morning of the 5th of January, when the wind finally stopped and the sun came up on a transformed white world, Otto Schreiber rode his mule along the drifted line of the creek, checking on every claim within 10 miles of his own, and he came at last to the Johnson cabin, 300 yards east of Clara's, and he dismounted, and he opened the door. He was a long time inside. When he came out, he stood for a moment in the brilliant, cold sun with his hat in his hand, and then he put his hat back on and he rode to Clara's cabin, and he knocked. And when she opened the door, he did not speak for a moment, but only looked at her, and Clara understood before he said it what he had found. "All 4 of them," he said quietly. "Father, mother, 2 boys. The father had an axe in his hand. There were marks on the inside wall by the door. He had been pounding." Clara did not speak. "They had a conventional fireplace," Otto said. "I checked the woodpile. They had burned through what should have been 2 weeks of fuel in 3 days trying to keep the cabin above freezing. They ran out yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. The mother and the boys went first. The father had the axe. He had been trying to break out, perhaps, to get to my place or to yours. Otto Schreiber looked at her cabin. He looked at the small, clean column of smoke rising from her stack. He looked at the warm stone he had laid his hand on 3 weeks earlier, and had stood with his eyes closed beside. And Clara saw on his face the thing she had been trying for, 2 days now, not to put into words inside her own head. 15 feet of stone, Clara, he said quietly. 300 yards. That is all there was between them and what you have here. She did not answer. She could not answer. Otto Schreiber rode home to break the news to his wife. Clara Marsh closed her cabin door behind him and stood for a long time with her back against it, in the warm, long, radiating heat of a cachalothen that had drawn its first breath 3 weeks before, and had not yet, for 1 minute of 1 hour of any day or night, since stopped doing the work that an old German mason no one had listened to had once tried in vain to give to a country that did not want it. Outside, the smoke kept rising. Inside, the 16-year-old girl who had built it slid slowly down the door and sat on the warm, packed earth of her own floor and put her face against her own knees and understood for the first time in her young life the full and terrible weight of being the person who survived. The weight of the Johnson family did not lift from Clara Marsh that winter. It settled. It settled the way snow settles on a roof quietly in layers, until one day a man looks up and understands that the load on the timbers above his head has become a thing he will have to learn to live under, or be broken by. She did not speak of them. Otto Schreiber, when he rode up the creek through the deep drifts of mid-January to check on her, did not speak of them either. They sat together by the warm chimney mass and drank a thin coffee Otto had brought in a tin, and they spoke of stones and of weather, and of the snares Clara had begun setting along the creek, and the 4 people 300 yards east of her cabin were not mentioned, and the not mentioning was its own kind of conversation. Otto rode away. Clara stood at her door and watched him go, and she felt the warm stone of the cachalothen at her back, and she understood that the price of having survived was that she was now going to have to be useful enough to deserve it. The food gave out on the 12th of February. She had been rationing for weeks down to a single small meal a day of cornmeal mush and whatever she could pull from her snare line. And the snares had failed her for 9 days running. The deep cold had driven the rabbits into the brush and kept them there. Her body, never heavy, had begun to consume itself. She could feel her ribs through her dress. Her cheeks had hollowed. Her hair, when she ran her fingers through it at night, came away in slow, soft strands. On the morning of the 12th, she rose to gather firewood and found that her legs would not carry her past the door. She sat down on the packed earth of her own floor with her back against the warm stone and understood calmly that she might not get up again. The cabin temperature dropped through the day. Without a fresh firing, the chimney mass radiated for 18 hours and then began to cool. And by the 3rd day after her last fire, the air inside the cabin had dropped to 26 degrees. The stone at her back was no longer warm. Outside, the wind moved through the firs, and Clara Marsh sat in the cold dim of the thing she had built, and thought with the slow, careful clarity she had used for every problem of the winter, that she had built a perfect engine and forgotten to build the fuel that ran the engine that ran her own body. It was on the 15th of February that Edmund Hale came up the creek on his tall bay horse. She heard him before she saw him. The bay's hooves had a heavier sound in the snow than Otto's mule. She did not rise. She did not have the strength to rise. She heard him dismount. She heard him cross the small bare yard outside her door. She heard him knock once hard, as a union engineer knocks on a door, and when she did not answer, he opened it himself and stepped through. He stopped in the doorway. She did not look up at him. She did not need to. She knew what he was seeing. The cold, dim cabin, the cold chimney stone, the girl on the floor with her back against the stone, and her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the closed firebox damper, as if waiting for it to make some decision she could not make for herself. Edmund Hale set down what he had been carrying. She heard the soft weight of it on her sleeping pallet. She smelled a moment later what it was: the clean, cold smell of frozen meat, the dry, mealy smell of dry beans. Her stomach turned over inside her, as a sleeping animal turns over in its den, and she swallowed, and she still did not look up. Edmund Hale stood in the doorway for a long while. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been in December. The voice of a man who has ridden a long way in a cold wind, perhaps, or the voice of a man who has rehearsed a thing he is not quite ready to say. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Mr. Hale, I have brought you a hind quarter of elk and a sack of beans. I shot the elk 3 days ago on the ridge above my own claim. I would have come sooner. The drifts were too deep until yesterday." "Thank you, sir." He did not move from the doorway. "Your chimney works better than mine," he said. She did look up then, slowly. Her neck felt as if it had not been used in a long time. She looked at him across the cold cabin. Edmund Hale, union engineer, 42 years old, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hand, and his face raw from the wind, and his eyes fixed somewhere on the dim shape of the cachalophin behind her. "I built a new firebox in my own cabin last week," he said. "I tore out the conventional fireplace. I built a cachalophin. I used your drawings from memory. I built it badly, I think, because the draft is poor and the channels are too tight. But it works, Miss Marsh. It works better than what I had before. I burned half the wood I burned in December. My wife sleeps warm through the night for the first time in 2 winters." He paused. "I came in December prepared to instruct you. I want you to know that I have not forgotten that. I have not forgotten any of it. Your chimney works better than mine, and the reason it works better is that you listened to a man no one listened to, and I did not. I am a union engineer, Miss Marsh. I was trained at West Point. I have built bridges that carried a corps of artillery, and the best chimney in this valley was built by a 16-year-old girl with a piece of broken glass and a Bible. I think about this, Miss Marsh. I think about this a great deal." Clara did not speak. "I will not stay," Edmund Hale said. "You will want to eat without an audience, but I will be back next week, and the week after, until the spring comes. You will not starve on this creek while I have meat in my smokehouse. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good day, Miss Marsh." "Good day, Mr. Hale." He closed the door behind him. She heard the bay horse move away through the snow. She sat for a long time without rising, because the rising was going to hurt, and because the gift on the pallet was going to undo her, and she wanted one last quiet moment before it did. Then she rose. She rebuilt her fire. She thawed a strip of elk against the warming stone of the firebox and chewed it slowly, the way her mother had taught her to chew jerky. And she felt the strength come back into her hands within an hour, and into her legs by nightfall. And by the next morning she was on her feet again, walking her snare line alive in the cold air, and the cachalophin was burning hot and clean behind her, and the smoke was rising in the high blue sky in a clean straight column, the way it had risen every clear day since December. She did not die that February. She did not die that March either. The thaw came down off the slopes in the first week of March, and Clara Marsh stood at her door one morning and watched the meltwater move along the French drain she had dug in November, sliding around the back of the cabin and out to the creek, the way she had calculated it would, and not a drop of it came through her floor. She walked the back of the cabin and laid her hand on the dry packed earth of the inner wall. Edmund Hale, she thought. You were right about a great many things. You were not right about that. By the middle of March, the snares were filling again, and the wild onions were pushing green through the wet soil along the creek. And Clara was eating twice a day and beginning to put weight back on her bones. Otto Schreiber came up the creek with a small sack of seed potatoes from his root cellar and showed her where to plant them on the small south-facing slope above the cabin. Edmund Hale came up the creek with a second hindquarter of elk and refused again to stay. Silas Croft came up the creek with news. The railroad was coming. The Northern Pacific had begun pushing track west again after the panic of '73. And by autumn there would be a crew of 30 men camped 12 miles south of the alcove, and that crew was going to need a cook. I told them about you, Silas Croft said. He stood at her door with his hat in his hand, the way a man stands when he is offering a thing he is not entirely sure will be accepted. I told them about the cabin. I told them about the winter. I told them anyone who can survive what you survived and build what you built can feed 30 men 3 times a day without losing her temper. They are willing to pay $20 a month and board from September to November. You will sleep in your own cabin and ride down to the camp at first light. $20, Clara said. $20. In coin, in coin. She thought about it for a long moment. $20 a month for 3 months. $60 in hand by the time the snow came down again. $60 would buy a great deal of fire brick. $60 would buy a proper axe and a proper saw and a milk cow and a small flock of laying hens and the seed for a garden twice the size of the one she had planted that spring. $60 would buy her for the first time in her life the right not to be entirely dependent on the kindness of the older men of this valley. I will do it, she said. You will keep your cabin. I will keep my cabin. No one will ask you to leave this claim, Miss Marsh. You held it through the winter. By the law of this country, common law if not statute, the claim is yours. The railroad will not interfere with that. I have made sure of it. She looked at him. Why? She said. He considered the question. He turned his hat in his hands. Because I have a daughter, Miss Marsh, he said at last. She is 12 years old. She lives with my sister in St. Louis. Her mother died of the fever in '68. I think about my daughter every day I am out in this country. I think about what would happen to her if I died on a survey line and her uncle took it into his head to put her out of his house. I do not know that he would. He is a decent enough man. But I think about it. And I would like to believe, Miss Marsh, that if such a thing ever happened to her, there would be old men in whatever country she found herself in who would do for her what we have all done for you. Clara did not speak for a moment. Then I am in your debt, Mr. Croft, she said. You are in no one's debt, Miss Marsh. You earned every stone of this cabin. We are only doing what decent men do. He rode away down the creek trail. Clara stood at her door and watched him go. In April, she began to teach. It started with Agnes Porter. The widow had come up the creek in December and had laid her hand on the warm chimney stone and had said with that flat, dry frontier humor of hers, I will be damned. Voss wasn't crazy, we were just too stubborn to listen. She came back in April with her boy Daniel and a string of questions, and Clara walked her through every line of the Catchalofen as if she were walking her through the rooms of a house. The footprint, the firebox, the serpentine channels, the thermal mass to room size ratio, the wide bends, the friction loss correction, the damper, the wind cap. Agnes listened with the close, hard attention of a woman who had lost a husband to a Montana winter and had no intention of losing herself or her children to another one. By the time she rode home that afternoon, she had a plan in her head for the cabin she would rebuild in the summer, and a list in her hand of the materials she would need, and a date set for Clara to come and help her lay her own foundation. Word of it traveled. By the end of April, Clara had been asked by 3 other families in the valley to come and walk their cabins and tell them how a catchalofen might be added or built into them. She walked the cabins. She did not charge, not in money. She accepted instead what families like that had to give: a bag of flour, a side of bacon, a clutch of laying hens, a young heifer calf in the case of one family that she walked home along the creek trail and built a small lean-to for behind her cabin, where the calf grew through that summer, into the first milk cow Clara Marsh had ever owned. By June, she had laid the foundation of a catchalofen in Agnes Porter's new cabin. By July, she had supervised the building of a second catchalofen in the cabin of a young couple who had come up the trail from Wyoming with a baby on the way. By August, she had advised on a third, a smaller version meant only to supplement an existing fireplace in Otto Schreiber's own cabin 7 miles north. Otto's wife, a small, sharp-eyed German woman named Hannah, who had baked the schoolhouse script note. Clara still carried in the back of her Bible, embraced Clara at the door of her own house when the small catchalofen drew its first clean breath, and called her in German Kleine Tochter, little daughter. And Otto looked away and did not say anything for a long time. The railroad crew arrived in the first week of September. Clara rode down to the camp before dawn each morning on a sturdy bay mare Edmund Hale had sold her, at her insistence, for the fair value of 3 months of his wife's mending. She cooked breakfast for 30 men in a great iron pan over a cook fire she had laid out herself. She cooked dinner at noon. She cooked supper at dusk. She rode back up to her cabin in the long blue light of the autumn evenings, and she stabled the mare in the small shed she had built that summer, and she lit her own fire in her own catchalofen, and she ate her own meal in her own house. In the evenings she taught. Word had gotten around the camp by the second week. The 30 men of the crew had heard from Silas Croft, and from each other, and from the foreman about the cabin in the alcove, and the chimney that drew through 15 feet of stone. After supper, when the men sat around the central fire smoking and mending tack and waiting for the chill to drive them into their tents, Clara sat with them and she drew in the dirt with a sharpened stick. She drew the footprint of a catchalofen. She drew the firebox and the serpentine channels. She wrote out the friction loss correction. She wrote out the cross-sectional ratios. The men watched her draw. Some of them asked questions. Some of them did not. 2 of them, by the end of November, had asked her to write out the diagrams on a piece of paper. They could carry home to their own claims, and Clara wrote them out 4 pages each, in careful charcoal lines that copied as closely as she could the lines Heinrich Voss had drawn in the dust of a wagon train fire 2 years before. She did not draw them from memory anymore. She drew them from the back of her Bible, which she carried with her everywhere, and which she had begun to think of in the quiet of her own mind as the second life of an old German mason no one had listened to. The air remembered Mr. Voss. She thought sometimes when she pressed her thumb against the careful charcoal lines, the air kept it. Now the air is giving it back. It was at the railroad camp in the 3rd week of September that the thing happened with Edmund Hale that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. She was riding down to the camp at first light when she came around the bend below her cabin and saw a figure standing in the trail. It was Edmund Hale. He was on foot leading his bay. He held in his hand a folded newspaper. She drew up. Mr. Hale. Miss Marsh. He held up the newspaper. The Montana Post, he said. Yesterday's edition. They have printed an article on the 7th page. I think you should read it before you ride down to the camp." She took the paper from him. She unfolded it on the saddle in front of her. She found the 7th page. She found the article. The headline read, "A Remarkable Construction on the Bozeman Trail." The article ran nearly a column and a half. It was technical. It described with precision a small earth-sheltered cabin built into a south-facing alcove in the upper Yellowstone country. It described the foundations set on bedrock granite. It described the double log wall packed with fitted stone and clay. It described the serpentine masonry heater within. It gave the ratio of firebox cross-section to chimney cross-section. It gave the vertical rise. It noted the friction loss correction calculated for 3 wide bends. It estimated on the basis of an inspection conducted that summer the seasonal fuel consumption at approximately 1/5 that of a conventional structure of comparable interior volume. It described the wind cap. It described the French drain. It described, in short, every choice Clara Marsh had made in the alcove from the 26th of November through the 2nd of January. It was signed by Edmund Hale, engineer, formerly of the United States Army of the Potomac, late of the Yellowstone Valley. At the end of the article, in the final paragraph, set in plain type without flourish, were the following words. The cabin and the masonry heater described in this report were designed, calculated, and constructed by Miss Clara Marsh, age 16, during the winter of 1873. The undersigned takes no credit for the design, the construction, or the proof of concept. The undersigned only describes for the benefit of other settlers in this country the work of a person whose courage and intelligence have, in the present author's opinion, been the means by which a piece of long-neglected European engineering may now begin to save lives in the American West. Miss Marsh has authorized the publication of this account. She has refused payment. She has asked only that the work be attributed where possible to the man who first attempted to teach it to this country, and who died in the attempt, namely Heinrich Voss of Stuttgart, and most lately of the Yellowstone Valley, deceased January 1873. Clara read it through twice. She lowered the paper. She looked at Edmund Hale. He was standing in the road in the gray light with his hat in his hand and his baize reins draped over his arm, and he was looking somewhere past her left shoulder into the firs. "Mr. Hale." "Miss Marsh." "You wrote this." "I wrote it. I sent it to the editor in Helena 3 weeks ago. I did not tell you because I did not wish to raise your hopes. I was not certain he would print it. He has printed it. He has also written me a letter which I have in my saddlebag, indicating that he intends to reprint it in the Eastern papers, the Chicago Tribune, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, perhaps others. He believes the design is of national interest. You have put my name on it. I have put your name on it. Mr. Hale, it is not a gift, Miss Marsh," he said. He looked at her, then finally his iron gray eyes steady in the cold gray morning. "It is a correction. I came up that creek last December with a finished speech in my mouth. I told you 4 things were wrong with what you were doing. You corrected me on every one of them in your head in front of me with a piece of charcoal and the back of a Bible. I rode away from that alcove a different man than I rode up. I did not say so at the time because I did not know how. I am saying so now. This article is the saying so. I have been 20 years a union engineer, Miss Marsh, and I cannot build what you built. I cannot bring back the old German mason who first knew how to build it. I can only do one thing. I can tell the world that you built it and that he taught you, and I can sign my own name to the telling so that no one in the territory may say it is a child's boast or a frontier rumor. That is what I can do. So I have done it. Clara did not speak. The high, cold air moved through the firs. Somewhere down the trail, the smoke of the railroad camp's morning fires was beginning to rise above the trees. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I do not know what to say to you." "Then say nothing, Miss Marsh," Edmund Hale said. "Ride to your camp. Cook breakfast for 30 men. Live a long life. That will be answer enough." He put his hat back on. He swung up onto his bay. He rode away up the creek toward his own cabin, and he did not look back. And Clara Marsh sat on her mare in the cold gray morning and read the article one more time, and then she folded the paper carefully and placed it inside her coat against her chest. And she rode down to the camp, and she cooked breakfast for 30 men. She did not weep until that night alone in her own cabin, with the warm stone of the Cachalophan at her back and the Montana Post unfolded across her knees, and Edmund Hale's careful words running across the page in the lamplight. She wept the way she had not wept since the day her father threw her out of the wagon. She wept for the old mason in his unmarked grave 9 miles west on the Yellowstone, who had at last, more than 18 months after his death, been named in print. She wept for the man who had carved Built Wrong, died warm enough to know it on a piece of plankboard, and gone into the cold without ever having his name spoken again. She wept for the 4 members of the Johnson family 300 yards east of her in the deep snow. She wept for Dorothy Marsh, dead of the lung sickness when Clara was 8 years old, who had once told her daughter that the cold was not the enemy. And she wept last of all for the 16-year-old girl sitting on the cabin floor with a newspaper across her knees, who had thought she was alone in a country that did not want her, and was finding out slowly that she had been wrong about that too. She slept that night against the warm stone, and in the morning she rose and she rode down to the camp. And she did not weep again for a long time. The man came at the end of September. He came alone on a thin gray horse that had been ridden hard. He came up the creek trail in the late afternoon with the sun going down behind the western ridge, and Clara was at her cabin door pinning a clean apron to her dress to wear down to the supper fire. And she looked up at the sound of the gray horse, and she saw him, and she stopped with her hand at the pin. Her father had grown older. He had grown older, not the way Otto Schreiber had grown older, hard and weathered and useful. He had grown older the way certain men grow older when their bodies have outlasted whatever inside them used to drive their bodies. He was thinner. His shoulders were lower. His coat hung on him. The eyes that had once been the color of river ice had gone the color of a winter sky just before it gives up its snow. He had not shaved in several days. His hat was the same hat. His boots were the same boots. He drew up his thin gray horse perhaps 20 feet from her door, and he did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and he looked at her, and his eyes moved over her face and over her dress and over the apron in her hand and past her to the open door of the cabin and to the small clean column of smoke rising from the chimney into the gold autumn light. And Elias Marsh did not speak for a long time. Clara did not speak either. She had imagined this moment. She had imagined it in the cut bank in the first week. She had imagined it by the fire of the broken bottle. She had imagined it laying the foundation. She had imagined it through the long blizzard with the Cachalophan warm at her back, and the Johnsons pounding 300 yards east of her in the dark. She had imagined every possible version of what she would say to her father. If she ever saw him again, every clever cutting word, and every dignified silence, and every cold, quiet question. And now that he sat his thin gray horse in front of her door, she found that she had nothing prepared. The air had gone still inside her. There was no anger left in it. There was no joy in it either. There was only a strange quiet attention, as if she were watching a stranger arrive at someone else's house. "Clara," her father said. "Mr. Marsh," she said. He flinched. It was a small flinch. It moved the corner of his mouth. I read about you, he said. I read about you in a paper. The article was reprinted in Sioux Falls. I saw it. I was passing through. Yes, sir. You built that? Yes, sir. He looked past her at the cabin. He looked at the foundation she had laid in November. He looked at the double log wall packed with stone and clay. He looked at the roof and the chimney cap and the small column of smoke and the small lean-to behind the cabin, where the milk cow stood chewing in the gold light. And Clara watched her father's face and saw on it a thing she did not entirely understand. I have come to a decision, her father said. Yes, sir. You are not yet of age. No, sir. I am 17 this December. By the law of this territory, a daughter who is not yet of age is the responsibility of her father. The claim she holds is by extension his claim. I have ridden up here, Clara, to make that claim. I am within my legal right. I have spoken to a lawyer in Sioux Falls. He has confirmed it. The cabin, the land, the improvements, the cow. They are mine. He paused. He was not. Clara saw enjoying himself. He was a man reciting a thing he had practiced and was finding harder to say in the saying than he had imagined. You may stay on as my daughter, he said. Under my authority, you may continue to work the claim. You will pay over to me the wages of your cooking. You will accept my discipline. You will rejoin the family in the spring at the new place I have taken outside of Bozeman. Your sisters miss you. Clara did not answer. She heard behind her a small sound, a step on the packed earth of her own yard. She did not turn. She did not need to turn. Otto Schreiber had come around the corner of the cabin. He had ridden up earlier that afternoon, as he often did now, to take coffee with her before she rode down to the camp. He had been in the lean-to checking on the cow when the gray horse had come up the trail. He stepped out now into the yard behind Clara, and he stood with his old hands hanging loose at his sides, and he did not speak. A second step. Edmund Hale rode up the creek trail on his bay. He had come perhaps on some errand. He had heard perhaps that a stranger on a thin gray horse had been seen riding north out of Bozeman 3 days before. He drew up at the edge of the yard. He did not dismount. He sat his bay and he looked at Elias Marsh, and he said nothing. A third step. Silas Croft came up the trail behind Edmund. He had ridden up from the railroad camp on a question about the next week's provisioning. He drew up beside Edmund Hale. He sat his horse and he looked at Elias Marsh and he said nothing. A fourth. Agnes Porter walked up the creek trail on foot with her boy Daniel beside her. She had come perhaps to bring Clara a jar of the new butter from her own churn. She stopped at the edge of the yard. She did not speak. The wind moved through the firs. Elias Marsh sat his thin gray horse in front of his daughter's door, and he looked at the 4 people who had come into the yard behind her, without invitation and without announcement. And he understood slowly what he was looking at. He looked at Otto Schreiber, who had given her an axe head and a broken saw and 3 pounds of salt pork, and the news that an old friend had not died for nothing. He looked at Edmund Hale, who had ridden up the creek in December to instruct her, and had ridden away with a piece of the instruction broken inside him, and who had spent the year since writing her name into the public record of the territory. He looked at Silas Croft, who had taught her to build a wind cap, and had hired her to feed 30 men, and had told the railroad that the claim was hers. He looked at Agnes Porter, who had laid her hand on the warm chimney stone, and had named the old Mason Voss, and had built her own cachelofen by Clara's hand. He looked last of all into the distance, where if a man stood at the right place on the rise above the cabin, and looked across the rolling country of the valley, he could see in the gold autumn light of late afternoon 7 separate columns of smoke rising from 7 separate cachalafins that had not been there a year ago. Elias Marsh looked at his daughter. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked once more at the cabin she had built. He looked once more at the 4 faces in the yard behind her. He looked perhaps for some piece of the speech he had practiced that he could still use some legal phrase, some paternal claim, some last assertion of the authority he had exercised over her on the morning of the 14th of November in the previous year. There was nothing to say. He turned his thin gray horse. He rode away down the creek trail, and the dust of the trail rose behind the gray horse's hooves, and the wind moved through the firs. And Clara Marsh stood in her doorway in her clean apron, with her hand still at the pin, and watched her father go. He did not look back. Otto Schreiber put one hand on Clara's shoulder for a brief moment, and then took it away. Edmund Hale touched the brim of his hat to her, and turned his bay and rode after Elias, perhaps, to make sure the man went south and not back, perhaps only to give Clara her yard back. Silas Croft did the same. Agnes Porter walked across the yard to Clara and pressed the jar of new butter into her hands, without a word, and walked back down the creek trail with her boy Daniel beside her. The yard emptied. The smoke rose. Clara Marsh stood at her door for a long time, and then she went inside, and she set the jar of butter on her small table, and she sat down beside her cachalafin and pressed her back against the warm stone. And she did not weep this time, because she had wept enough for one autumn. She sat in the warm dim of her own cabin, and she thought for a long while of nothing in particular. She thought of the smoke. She thought of the 7 columns. She thought of the gray horse going south down the creek trail. She thought of a Shawnee woman in Ohio who had died when her daughter was 8 years old, and who had once said that the cold was not the enemy. She thought of an old German mason in an unmarked grave on a fork of the Yellowstone. She thought last of all of a man whose name she did not know, whose boot she had buried under a fir tree at the mouth of the alcove a year before, and whose 10 carved words she had carried in her head every day since. Built wrong. Died warm enough to know it. She had built true. She had lived to know it. The years moved. The winter of 74 to 75 came down on the valley with all the teeth Montana could give it, and 7 cachalafins burned through it, and not one family that had built to Clara's design lost a soul. By the winter of 75, there were 11. By 76, there were 19. By 78, there were 31. By the end of the decade, there were 43. The mortality rate from cold in the upper Yellowstone country, which had run somewhere around 12% in the winters before Clara Marsh built her cabin, dropped over the next 6 years to less than 2%. Children grew up in those cabins. Old men died in their beds in those cabins of natural causes, the kind of death a frontier country had rarely been able to offer its old men. Families that had buried infants every January in the years before began instead to baptize them in the spring. Walter Crane came to the valley in the summer of 76. He was a surveyor for the territorial government, 29 years old, sober and careful in his work, with a long, quiet face that had taken Clara some weeks to read. He had been sent to document for the territorial archives examples of frontier architecture that had proved unusually durable in the Montana climate, and he had ridden up the creek to the alcove on his second day in the country, and he had spent 3 days measuring and sketching and asking careful questions, and he had filed a report with the Montana Historical Society in Helena that ran to 42 pages and described the cabin in his own careful hand as an intuitive engineering of rare sophistication, combining Central European thermal mass principles with frontier necessity and a sensitivity to landscape that this surveyor has not previously encountered in any structure of this region. He came back the next summer. He came back the summer after that. By the autumn of '78, he had asked Clara Marsh, who was 21 years old by then, to marry him. And Clara had thought about it for 3 days and had said yes. Not because she needed rescuing, because she did not, but because she had found in Walter Crane a man who respected what she had built and who understood what she had become and who did not seem to need to make her smaller in order to feel like a man beside her. They were married in a small ceremony at the cabin in October. Otto Schreiber stood for her in place of the father she did not invite. Edmund Hale wrote from a new posting in Helena a letter that Walter Crane read aloud during the toasts. Agnes Porter brought the cake. Silas Croft sent from a survey camp in the Bitterroot a silver dollar struck in 1873, the year of the cabin, mounted in a small wooden frame with a brass plate engraved, to Clara Marsh Crane on her wedding, the year the warmth began. They raised 4 children in the alcove, 2 boys and 2 girls. The cabin grew with them. By the 1880s, Clara and Walter had added 2 rooms and then 2 more, and then a proper root cellar, and a smokehouse and a small forge. And the original alcove had become the deep, warm heart of a house that sprawled outward from it, like roots from a great trunk. Clara taught herself to shoe a horse. She taught herself to fire a small batch of clay tiles in a kiln she built herself, with which she finally, in the summer of 1884, rebuilt the firebox of the original Kakelhofen out of true fire brick of her own making. The sandstone firebox lasted 11 winters. The fire brick replacement lasted the rest of the chimney's life. Clara's oldest daughter, who was named Dorothy for the grandmother she never knew, grew up believing that all houses were built into the sides of hills, with great stone chimneys taking up a quarter of the parlor, because all the houses she had ever entered in her early life were built that way. She wrote in a memoir published in 1943 that she had been 23 years old before she had set foot in a house with a conventional fireplace, and that her first thought on feeling the cold draft coming down the open flue had been that the architect must have been incompetent. Clara Marsh Crane lived in the alcove for the rest of her long life. Walter died in 1912 of a fever he caught surveying the headwaters of the Sun River. Clara mourned him for 2 years. She did not remarry. She raised the youngest of her children to adulthood. And then in her early 60s, she opened a small school in the front room of her own cabin and taught the children of the valley to read and to do their figures and to understand, when they were old enough, the principles of thermal mass and the calculations of friction loss in a serpentine flue. She was interviewed by a reporter from the Billings Gazette in 1924. When she was 67 years old, the reporter asked her how it had felt to have survived at 16 what most people would have considered impossible odds. She had looked at him for a long moment over the rim of her coffee cup in the warm front room of the cabin she had built, and she had said something. He wrote down word for word, and that the paper printed the following Sunday, and that the Montana Historical Society would later carve in 1953 into a small bronze plaque set into a stone at a roadside pullout above the alcove. I didn't think about odds. I thought about problems and solutions. I needed shelter. I found a hillside. I needed heat. I remembered an old man's drawings. I needed to survive. So I did the work. The country didn't care about my feelings or my age or what I was. It only cared whether I could learn fast enough and work hard enough. It turned out I could. She died in 1937 at the age of 80. Her children buried her on the rise above the cabin beside Walter, with a small fitted sandstone marker she had cut for herself in her 70s and stored under her bed against the day. The marker read only Clara Marsh Crane, 1857 to 19 ___. She built true. The blank date was filled in by her oldest son with a chisel 3 days after the funeral. The cabin stood until 1952. By then, the children were old, and the grandchildren were scattered, and the National Forest Service had begun to take an interest in the small, earth-sheltered structure on the upper Yellowstone that was now 79 years old, and showing finally the first real signs of settling. The Forest Service negotiated a purchase with the surviving heirs. The plan was to dismantle the cabin for safety reasons and to document it as a historic site. Before the dismantling, however, the Forest Service did one last thing. They hired a masonry expert. He was a man named Carl Muller, a third-generation Mason of German descent who taught at a technical school in Bozeman, and who had spent his career studying the history of European masonry heaters. He came up to the alcove in the spring of '52 with a notebook and a set of calipers and a long brass plumb line, and he spent 2 days inside the cabin, measuring every dimension of the cachalofen Clara Marsh had built in December of 1873. He filed his report with the Forest Service in May. He wrote in part the following: "The serpentine flue channels are within 4% of optimal modern calculations for a structure of this interior volume and this fuel type. The cross-sectional ratios are within 2%. The friction loss correction expressed in additional stack height per horizontal foot of flue is essentially identical to the formula that was first published by an engineering journal in Munich in 1911. The wind cap is a textbook example of the form. The thermal mass to room ratio is by the modern standards of passive house design ideal. Whoever built this structure either had access to engineering texts that did not, to my knowledge, exist on the American frontier in 1873, or arrived at this solution through pure empirical reasoning of a kind I have rarely encountered. The undersigned can find no third explanation. There had been no such texts. There had been only a 16-year-old girl with a piece of broken glass, and the back pages of a family Bible and the long, careful patience to listen to an old man no one else had listened to. The Forest Service dismantled the cabin in the autumn of '52. They documented every stone. They preserved the keystone of the firebox arch and the stone collar of the wind cap and 3 of the original sandstone slabs from the foundation. These objects are today in the year of this telling on display at the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena, in a small glass case with a brass plate. The brass plate reads as follows: "Stones from the chimney mass of an early Cachalofen-style masonry heater built in November and December of 1873 by Clara Marsh, age 16, in an alcove on the upper Yellowstone. Built without tools, formal instruction, or assistance from any person trained in masonry. The design was derived from the spoken instruction of Heinrich Voss of Stuttgart, an emigrant master mason, whose work was almost entirely lost at his death in January 1873. The structure operated for 79 consecutive winters without significant failure. The stones in the case are warm to the touch on summer afternoons, when the sun comes through the museum's south-facing windows and finds them. They are not as warm as they once were. They have not held the heat of a real fire in a long time. But they hold it long enough on a hot July afternoon that a man who lays his hand on the glass above them can feel faintly through the case the slow, patient radiation of stone that was once part of something larger. That is the only memorial Clara Marsh ever asked for. That is the only memorial she ever needed. She thought about problems and solutions. She did the work. The country did not care about her feelings or her age or what she was. It only cared whether she could learn fast enough and work hard enough. It turned out she could.